And good afternoon. I am James Just, and welcome to Counterpoint Conversations. With me today is Libertarian activist, and he was the national volunteer coordinator for the Jo Jorgensen, well, a national campaign. Or were you the national campaign?
I was
What?
national volunteer coordinator, basically a guy helping out, making sure we had people able to do things to help the campaign.
Yeah. And this show is here. We exist on this show to have conversations with libertarians, libertarian activists, people who maybe want to understand and learn more about libertarianism. And we discuss it on a friendly conversational platform instead of, like the in other places and other formats where it's more confrontational. We sit down and play. We're not afraid to play devil's advocate. We're not afraid to question ideas, to question, you know, um, philosophies, but we are here to try to explain it, to try and understand better the the deeper meanings behind libertarianism and what we actually mean by freedom, and how does freedom actually interact with the world, and what happens when two people's rights interact, and how do we kind of navigate and manage that, and what does all that mean when it comes in terms of the civilization, and when you have a third of the population wants a bigger government, and a third of the population doesn't care, and a third of it wants smaller government. How do you make all that work? And that's why we're here to talk about that. And so what are actually the limits of freedom, Kevin? That's one of the kind of an overriding discussion, but at the same time, it's an important one that we actually don't discuss in popular
Yeah,
context.
and James, that's why I wanted to bring this to you and to your viewers. Is talking among libertarians, there are a lot of different perspectives on just what government should do, just what people should do, and how we should handle issues related to different people's freedoms and how they interact with each other. And I think it's important for us to explore those ideas so that we can be clear about what areas are there where freedom should be limited, so we can clearly share our message with people outside of the Libertarian Party. And the goal then is to go out to a broader audience and connect with people outside of us and be able to share that clear message, and also understand where their perspectives are and where they're coming from when they might have some concerns or fears about certain situations that might arise or maybe have arisen in the past, either for them personally or historically, where they want to make sure that, hey, I don't want that to happen to me. I guess the first thing, the obvious thing, the one that we almost don't think about because most libertarians are very nice people, we want to do the right thing for others, is don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. That's kind of the foundation of libertarian ideas. But there are people out there who would do exactly that if given the opportunity to. And there needs to be some mechanism for managing that. If someone infringes on another person's body, on their rights, on their property, government was founded for the purpose of protecting people's lives, liberty, and property. That's how Locke originally said it before our founders turned it around a little bit and talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the goal is the same, that people should be secure in their persons and their property and not have any interference from outside parties, even the government, trying to take that from them without cause.
Yeah, and the question is, when is it okay to take your stuff, right? Well, because the government takes taxes, and that's your stuff, right? You have to taking taxes, paying the money, and we all kind of say, okay, schools, roads, police, fire, that kind of thing. I think even libertarians will grudgingly pay taxes for roads if the roads actually got paved and the schools were actually good and the police responses, dealt with violent crime and fraudsters. But what we don't like is all the other stuff, right, that comes along with it. But how do you decide what is fraud? How do you decide how much taxes is too much? When do you decide things like eminent domain, when you have to build a road and you need to, what do you do? All those things, when these interactions, when these competing moralities, when they interact, that's a difficult question, right? It's not straightforward. And we as libertarians, we like to kind of make it simple. It's don't take my stuff. It's my, but it's not as simple as it is, because, the rainwater from my neighbor comes into my yard, right? And so if his yard has a bunch of dog leftovers in it, it ends up in my yard. So when is he infringing on my right to not have dog leftovers in my yard? Or vice versa, as cases may go. Some of
Yeah.
us are.
Or in India, when a major corporation had a cyanide leak at their plant and hundreds of people were killed. Now, in that case, they knew exactly where it was coming from, but there are common resources. And we're getting more and more able to identify the source of different things and the cause of different things. And that's both creating opportunities to hold individuals accountable for their actions, but it's also causing more people to request further and further restrictions on people's rights. We might be able to identify, hey, it's the stuff from that manufacturing plant over there that's causing the cancer. We can hold those people accountable for it. We can take them to court and force them to use a different substance or hold them liable for what they've done. But then it also creates situations where people say, well, no, I don't want you to be able to smoke in my apartment building or in a park that I walk in. And how do we draw the line between those things where people can, have their own choice of what they want to do, given the realities of different situations? And I think one of the pieces there is I've tried to look through step by step. What are the basic underlying principles that people use in thinking about, well, government should be doing this for me, or government needs to stop that person from doing this to me. And one of them, I think one of the biggest ones, is risk, especially life endangering risk. Nobody has a right to put me at risk of my life without my consent. If I choose to jump out of an airplane with or without a parachute, preferably with, I can do that. But if I throw someone else out of an airplane with a parachute, that's not okay. It's a dangerous situation, and they have the right to make that choice for themselves. And we've seen that recently in a variety of things. Some people have very different attitudes towards risk associated with, and I don't want to dwell on COVID here because we've talked it to death, but whether they take a vaccine, or whether they're with someone who's taken a vaccine, or whether they come down with COVID. I know lots of 80-year-olds who are like, look, I got maybe 10 years left on this planet. I just want to see my grandkids and have a good time, and I don't care. And I know people in their 70s who are like, wow, there's a 1 in 200 chance that I die if I get this. I'm going to not allow anyone to come into my house, and I'm not going to talk with anybody, and I'm just going to sequester myself completely. Not how I live my life, but each of them has the right to make that decision for themselves. What they don't have a right to do is to make that decision for someone else. Let me give you another example.
Well, I want to back up just for a second, back to the property one, because you talked about the manufacturing plant that has a leak, a gas leak. And the question is, why is, maybe that's the reason for zoning laws, right? So you don't put a residential area around a freaking plant that has an opportunity to spill hazardous chemicals. So what if the plant was there first and people chose to move next to a chemical plant, is that an actual choice? Did they put themselves at risk or not? Now, and at what time does the government say, we just can't allow people to live next to a chemical plant. And if the chemical plant was there first, then you can't put people there. And if the people were there first, you can't put the chemical plant there. And maybe that's kind of the role. And maybe somebody owns property near a chemical plant and they'd want to put a house there, but they says, no, you can't do it. And maybe that's, a kind of a line where you get to lose, you have to lose some of your rights because.
Yeah. And this is where it gets complicated, because someone puts in a paint manufacturing plant where they're using ethanol and there's nothing major that could be hazardous, and suddenly someone changes it to a jet fuel production plant which has some really highly toxic stuff in it, and now there's a big change there. That is exactly the reason why zoning laws were originally created, for the purpose of separating out, hey, this is going to be a noisy area until 2 a.m. Let's not have, parents with school-age kids there unless they really want to live there. This is a commercial area. If you want to have a business, it's going to be open till all hours of the night. That's where it's going to be. So we can keep people in their neighborhoods in a more quiet environment, because it's hard to limit noise. There are some technologies that can actually cancel out noise, but people like to have peace and quiet in their houses. And that's one of the things that becomes a nuisance issue for the police to deal with, is when people are making too much noise at the wrong time of day. And we see this as well with people who work third shift or other shifts, trying to get the peace and quiet that they want when they're sleeping in the middle of the day, and they have a similar situation there. So exactly with the zoning laws.
Yeah, no one gets to go do yard work at 4 a.m. But yet, for those of us who work at 4 a.m. and trying to sleep at noon, you know, you know, you have to deal with yard workers, and it's just the way life works, and you have to deal with it. But it just kind
Yeah.
of is. And there is that. And we've taken zoning laws. We've gone from, okay, rational zoning laws to keep houses away from chemical plants, and we've turned it into ways to manufacture and society. We've done something completely different with them than their original intent. And so that's where the danger is, right? It's kind of the moral dilemma, the moral danger, right? The moral hazard is, okay, you can make an excuse for these rare occasions, but then somebody with their own agenda uses it for, to keep poor
Yeah.
people away from the rich areas. And
Yep.
yeah,
Yep. Or yeah, we want our neighborhood to be affluent. We don't want multifamily housing here. And California has recently passed some laws dealing with that because nobody wants to have multi-housing in their neighborhood because then their property prices will go down. And it's not about any sort of meaningful protection of people and the separation of business from residential areas, but it's about people trying to manipulate the economy to their advantage. And so, yeah, there's a
yeah,
snowball effect where more and more people try to use these mechanisms to do other things. And the problem with it is it's subjective. As soon as we start talking about risk, right? I mean, if I talk about, the risk associated with having a cyanide plant next door to me versus the risk of a peanut butter plant next door to me if I happen to be allergic to peanuts. One of those is a much higher risk than the other one is, but it's still subjective. And once you introduce the argument, people can bring that argument with a wide variety of different levels of subjective intensity, independent of whether it's a serious matter or not. Separating out the ones that are really not intended as the original purpose of protecting rights with these different regions. That would be the first step. But you still have the problem of someone's going to take it to the next step and the next step and the next step until someone goes too far. It's going to happen.
yeah. We can talk about property values. You talk about property values. That's actually a perfect example because when we say property values, everybody automatically thinks theoretical resale value rather than the emotional value of a house gets you, the long-term stability that a house brings to your family, the roots that a long-term family brings to a culture. No one talks about those values in property values. No one talks about the use value, of your house. Everybody talks about this theoretical property sale value, but they don't talk about the other values. We completely ignore all the other values that come along with property, and we all just focus on the cash, the money, when that's only not even half. And who knows, whatever percentage it is, it's just a small percentage of the total package of value, and we don't discuss that at all. Even amongst libertarians, amongst the general populace, none of us do. And it's a shame because we think we're protecting values. We think we're protecting communities by protecting property values. But, California is a perfect example of we're actually hurting our communities by propping up these property values. We're destroying communities by these, these, what do you say, manipulations of the market, deliberate manipulations of the market for somebody else's perspective, somebody else's agenda. And we don't know why, and the average person doesn't know why. It's not like we don't know why, but the average person, doesn't know why. My house used to be $300,000. Now it's $500,000. Why? My neighborhood hasn't changed any. My neighborhood's still on the edge of the ghetto. I don't understand, but that's the way it is. And
yeah, you were talking about eminent domain earlier. That comes up in that situation where there might be someone who would look. It's not about whether it's 500,000 or $1 million you give me. I want to live out the rest of my life in my house. This is where I live. I don't want to move.
My grandfather built it. In my particular case, my grandfather built my house. He literally built it brick by brick. There's not really a dollar value that you can put on that.
The original intent of those laws was that one person who happened to have a house that was right in the middle of where they knew a development was going to go couldn't hold an entire community hostage for negotiating purposes. But it's been abused so badly and used to just take money from one person and give it to another. It's a hard situation, and one that I would not want to employ at all if there was any alternative. I mean, certainly infrastructure changes over time, but as a libertarian, I would prefer not to use eminent domain and let people negotiate for themselves or find other solutions. If somebody doesn't want that house, we've seen the examples where there's the house right here and then there's the new skyscraper all around it. That's probably going to reduce the emotional value of their home, limiting their views and changing the traffic around them. But they would have a choice of accepting an offer or dealing with the construction and the later opportunity in that situation.
Well, and a lot of times they actually kind of end up liking it because it's unique, right? It stands out. It makes it, it makes something unique. And so, for decades out, so other people, hey, there's this little strange house right here in the middle of man, it makes a nice, unique.
And the impact on the companies and the architecture is overstated. I mean, it's almost never a real issue. It's easy to build around one if it's necessary. And, then there can be a legitimate negotiation between a small property owner and a big corporation. And that's another area where limits on freedom come into play, is when a big guy takes advantage of a little guy, because that big corporation can afford, hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, and they've got lobbyists working with the local, county, city council, and they're kind of shaking hands and making deals behind the scenes. Grandma homeowner doesn't have the ability to do that. She's never been to a city council meeting, or maybe she has, but she doesn't have the same clout or the same importance from a dollar perspective to the city, where she can negotiate for them to use their power to do something.
Yeah, our city leaders, our government leaders have now essentially given up representing the average person, and they now represent, who brings the most dollars in. Yeah. And in a sense, you can kind of understand it, but their literal job is to be the go-between between those two forces. They're the ones who are supposed to say no, and they're the ones who are supposed to say no. They're the ones who are supposed to be the adults in the room. They're the ones who are supposed to be the judgment. That's literally why we hire them, so we don't have to pay attention all the time. That's literally the reason we hire them.
That's the job,
and they don't do it. And
I don't think all of them is sold out, though. I think there are many good leaders in the community that are doing their best to weigh the balances between different alternatives, and they're not going to sell out an individual to some big corporation. But more and more there are examples, and there always have been. If you look back through history, the politicians who were upright and did the right thing and stood up to large financial interests have always been the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah, well, and once a city gets into a political machine status, then it becomes this whole different thing, right? It's like if your town or city hasn't accumulated the political machine yet, then you've actually got a pretty good bet of getting represented. That's why the smaller and medium-sized cities, they actually do a better job of representing their constituents than the larger cities. Like Sacramento has now become a political machine. It's now a political machine city. So, the powers that be have all the power, and the big developers are the ones who get what they want. And there's no such thing as medium and small developers anymore. All that kind of stuff that happens in the political machines in Chicago, New York, San Francisco. And, but that actually does come with risk. You were talking about risk earlier, and that comes with the risk when you have these political machines, because these politicians, they forget how to make these decisions, right? If they're not practiced at actually weighing all the various factors, when it comes time to weigh the various risk factors, they don't know how anymore. Because we talked about COVID, they were so focused on the medical side of it, they forgot all the other parts of the decisions they had to make. They forgot about the risk assessment of psychological impacts of their policies. They forgot about the economic impacts of their policies. They forgot about the impacts of their attempts to manipulate their way out of the economic impacts of their policies.
Well, I've found politicians in general be very bad at looking at the big picture from various perspectives. And they tend to, more than anything, have a very ivory tower perspective on, why doesn't everyone just work from home? Well, yeah, try doing that if you're a truck driver. Try doing that if you're a cashier or if you're a restaurant worker. 33% of a population could not possibly work from home because they're part of the distribution chain. And those people were absolutely decimated by the policies that were implemented. People who can work from behind a computer like you and me, hey, things worked out great for us. I didn't have to commute for a while, and life went on as normal, and I got to work kind of in the safety of my own home environment. But there are a lot of people who had a very different experience of that because they had a different type of job.
Yeah. Well, and we now know that the risk calculation was an error, but play a little devil's advocate. At the time, there was a panic. No one really knew how dangerous it really was. There was estimates that it was going to be, 2-3% death rate rather than the 0.2% or whatever it ended up. Good Lord, don't quote me on the percentages because who knows what it actually is. But they thought it was going to be much, much higher than it really was, right? Instead of 600,000, they were talking 3 to 6 million, right? It was a vastly different number. And so you can, in a sense, you can almost understand the panic at the beginning. And so to play a little devil's advocate, at what stage does it? Gary Johnson famously said, okay, maybe if it was a zombie apocalypse, I might mandate the vaccine, but you wouldn't have to. That was his statement. You might mandate a vaccine, but you wouldn't have to in a true zombie apocalypse because, God, I can't say that word today, because people would be lining up around the corner to get the shot.
Yeah. And good ideas don't require force. And I'm going to go back to what I said before, which is, risk is a very personal decision for each person individually. People should have absolutely the right to make that decision for themselves and look at risks from their own perspective and how they want to address those risks. Having something coming from a government authority about how risks must be handled is a problem. That needs to be an individual choice, and it's a choice that's different for everybody because we all have different attitudes towards risk.
Well, not just different attitudes. When you have a government or a bureaucracy making decisions, what you leave out is the exceptions. Someone like me who had a pre-existing condition that was not well understood, did not respond well to the shot. Well, how, right? And so how is I supposed to know that, right? I did my best to weigh the risks. And I like to think that, the public pressure had no impact on my decision to go ahead and get the shot. And even that, I knew, I took the Johnson & Johnson shot because I knew if I had any type of reaction at all, I wasn't going to get a second dose. I know me. And so I got the Johnson & Johnson shot. It ended up, I probably shouldn't have gotten any shot. But we didn't know that at the time. And that's part of the problem, right? Is because we don't know who's going to have the bad reaction.
Yeah. And, but you should be the one making that choice. Nobody should be making that choice for you. No, there should be no public pressure from government putting that pressure on you. Now, if private businesses choose to do something to protect their employees because, hey, the cashiers working at a grocery store are concerned that they're going to die, and their boss says, look, we want to protect you. We want to do this for our employees. The business has a right to do that. And I would support them.
Though, if a business requires that you get a shot, and then that shot, like me, makes you sick and you end up in the hospital for a while, who's legally responsible?
Well, that wasn't quite what I was talking about, but that's an excellent question. But I was talking about businesses requiring people coming in to wear masks. If a business chooses that, not because the government forced them to, that's a different thing. I would say that if a business forces someone to do that, they should be liable. If they're, because like you said, different people have different situations. And I don't want to, let's move on from COVID because we spent a lot of time talking about COVID for the last years. But I know many people in unusual situations where either they've chosen to not take it because they know that, hey, look, my body's different. I don't want to try that. Or they did, and either it worked out or some of them had some complications. But that the choice should be individual. And going back to risk, other types of risk. We look at other laws that we've come to accept here, like DUI. It's not okay to get shit-faced drunk and get behind the wheel of a car and put everyone around you at risk of dying. Now, if you want to get on a racetrack that's on your private property while you're drunk, go for it. Knock yourself out, literally. But not saying that it's a good idea. But if you're it's about putting other people at risk. Same thing for
It's the other people. Well, I can put an example. One of the consequences of my health issues was cataract exploded in size and I could no longer see. I had to stop driving because I could no longer see well. And I had to make that decision. And I made that decision before my doctors did, right? I decided, no, I'm too dangerous to be on the road. I have to get off. And it was precisely because, not because I was afraid of denting my car or I was afraid of hurting myself. I didn't want to not see somebody crossing the street. That's what I didn't want to see. I didn't want to hurt somebody else. And so I made the responsible decision to say, no, even though my doctor didn't tell me not to drive, even though I could still legally drive, I decided it's not safe enough for me to drive. So I'm pulling myself off the road.
Yeah. And there was a case about something like that in Colorado recently. There was a truck driver who had brake problems and he was running behind and he didn't make the responsible choice that you made and pull over and say, look, I just can't do this right now. I've got to do the responsible thing and pull my truck over. And he killed 4 people. His brakes failed and he killed 4 people. And he was sentenced to something like 120 years in jail. And that was then later reduced to 10 years, I think. But he was held accountable for that. And it's appropriate if someone puts other people at risk in a way that is not that they have not agreed to, there's an appropriate place for the government to take action there.
As someone who has been a professional driver, other people's safety is actually your main goal. As a delivery driver, a lot of people think your job is to take your packages and deliver them off. No, your job is to do that safely. That's actually your job. Your job is to do that without hitting anything, without crashing, without causing any damage. Is that to do that safely? Because anybody can actually go off and run into trash cans and, be irresponsible on the roads and get packages dropped off on time. What makes you a good driver is actually being able to do all that safely. And that's the difference between being a responsible human being and being, an irresponsible human being is knowing the difference between when to be safe and when to not. And as libertarians, we sometimes don't talk about that responsibility side of the equation enough. We talk about our freedom, we need our freedoms, and we say, yeah, but if you're going to be free, you have to be responsible. And a lot of times people talk responsible about, going off, getting jobs, taking care of it. But responsibility is more than that. It's about being careful what you put out into the world, right? It's be careful about who you are, be careful about what you say, be careful about what you do, be mindful so you don't hurt anybody. You don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. You don't want to hurt anybody's body. You don't want to hurt anybody's economics.
If we're talking about government, I will be the first to say you have every right to hurt whoever's feelings you want, but you don't have the right to hurt their person or their property. And I have a right to call you an asshole if I think that you're being a jerk and you're hurting people's feelings and you're being mean. But that's not something I think the government should be in the business of. If it's about people's emotions, that's a separate thing. But people's physical safety, their health, their well-being, their property. If you put someone else at risk without their consent, that's a problem. In exactly the same way that don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. Don't put other people at risk and don't put their stuff at risk unless they have agreed to do it. It's part of the same thing. I'm
actually gonna play a little devil's advocate on you. There was a recent case of a girl who, emotionally hurt her boyfriend until he committed suicide. Right? Mm-hmm. Remember this? There was a case of that. So
I know the case.
Yeah, and so it is wrong to emotionally. You have every right to call me an asshole if I'm being an asshole. This is true, But there may be better ways to accomplish the same goal, and that you can actually put out something better into the world rather than respond in kind. And to create this, I'm just saying, as to be a responsible human being is to try to find the best way to accomplish your goal, and maybe not responding in kind is the way. As I said, be careful what you put out there. Be careful what you think. And,
fair enough. And, I know that case. I think what she did was horrible. I'm actually glad she's in jail for what she did. But I'm also concerned about the precedent.
It's difficult. Yeah.
Because like with all this other stuff, as soon as the precedent's set, now it's subjective. It's a matter of, okay, how much emotional hurt is it okay to lock someone up for? If I say something and it hurts your feelings, can I get locked up for that? That's not okay.
No, but that's the question. How many times can you push somebody's button? But if you push somebody's buttons enough times, they're going to respond and punch you in the face. And at some point, I'm not going to care that they broke your nose, right?
Yeah,
You know,
that's prompted.
so
Yeah.
it's a difficult question, and it's one of those things that there's. We like to think there's universal. There's this nice, simple silver bullet kind of solutions. There's an easy line, and there's not. Lots of life is kind of this weird, strange gray area,
Yep.
and it's hard. And we can't figure out. We can't even start to refine where that line is if we can't talk about these things. And if we can't sit here and have rational conversations where we say, "Hey, look, I understand where you're coming from. That you want to be able, actually, being able to speak freely means you're going to offend some people sometimes, right? You're just going to, but you don't have to be an asshole about it, is kind of, I guess, my point. Is like, yeah, you're going to offend people, but you don't have to be an asshole about offending people, right? They're not going to be happy with you. People aren't always going to like what you say. I mean, people aren't always happy with what I say. I have a TV show every week, then trust me, people are not always happy with what I say, but they're actually quite pleasant on how they approach it. And so,
my overwhelming preference in those situations is for, private reputation and sharing information about people and public opinion to be the way to hold those people accountable rather than force of law. But I can see where there might be some people who think there are exceptions. And that was one of them. That was someone who was acting with malice to actually try to cause his actions. And she succeeded at it. And she succeeded at getting thrown in jail for it too. So I'm not going to shed a tear for her. That's for sure.
No, it's just, there's that solid line that we all want to have. It just doesn't really exist. It's all very fuzzy. And
if it's fuzzy, then why not push it all the way to the left side of the needle, right?
Yeah.
That's what ends up happening, is that if it's fuzzy, someone with bad intentions will use that power to do the wrong thing. Let me use that as an example. So you talked earlier about the big corporation trying to use eminent domain to take grandma's house away from her. That's not the only way that big corporations take advantage of the little guy. This here is one of the agreements from a credit card. I get these in the mail all the time. So do you probably, if you have a credit card. It's got all of the terms and conditions that have just been changed in my credit card agreement. And I'm sure they paid some lawyer $200, $300, $400 an hour for 20 hours to look this over. I have not hired a lawyer to look at this document. I cannot afford to hire a lawyer to look at this document. They got like 100,000 customers. They can afford to spend a lot of money on this. This agreement is crap. It's not an agreement. It's unilateral. And basically they've said they can change this agreement at any time. If they change it to say that if I'm late with a payment, that they get my firstborn in compensation, no, that's not legitimate. So how to deal with this? Actually, this is an area that California as a state does very well at. They basically say that this agreement is nothing. It really does not constitute much at all. If anything in this is outside of the realm of what's reasonable, it's not what they call a negotiated contract between peers. And as a result, they throw it out. They ignore it completely. On that note, I want to share a brief word about one of my personal heroes. His name is Dmitry Agarkov. And he had got a credit card application in the mail. And he decided he was going to have some fun with them. He took their credit card application and meticulously reproduced it, changing the terms ever so subtly to be vastly in his favor. And they issued him the credit card, and he has started taking advantage of things like, 0% interest on his card and not having to pay things back with any delay whatsoever. And they eventually took him to court and lost to try and enforce their original agreement. He had sued them for $700,000 for breaching the agreement that he had written. But I absolutely love that he did this, and that he was able to get the courts to hold the company accountable for the fact that, hey, they didn't read their own agreement and went ahead and issued this this card without having done thorough research. Well, if that can happen to a credit card company, how am I supposed to read through this document and understand what it means and the details of it? There are limitations on what can be put in there that are the limits of reasonableness and that don't take advantage of the disparity of resources between the company that can spend thousands of dollars on this document and me as an individual consumer.
Yeah, well, it's always bothered me that they can sit there and if Facebook or pick any social media, the credit card company, it doesn't matter. You agree to the terms of service, you set up everything based upon that terms of service that you agreed to, and then 6 months later they change it, and you say, well, now wait a minute, I've set all this up based upon an agreement we agreed to, but now you've changed the agreement. But I didn't agree to the change. You've made it. And that's always a problem because it's the change that bothers me. I actually don't mind the big long agreements that no one reads because my son actually reads them. But there are actually people who read them. But it's the fact that they can change them and you can't. So it's really not an agreement at all. It's just a contract that, rather than a terms of service agreement, it's not. It's a goofy contract. It's not even really a contract. And like you said, as California says, it's not real because it's not. There's no real exchange. There's no real negotiation. There's no real.
And it's appropriate to limit the way these agreements, quote unquote agreements, can be used for that reason. If we were to take that ability away, yeah, people might be more diligent and look these over in detail every time. But it's a disparity of resources. It's not reasonable for a person to be able to read through this every time you get a new agreement from your credit card company. And so it's a way of addressing that. In fact, a few years ago, there was a company, it was for April Fool's actually, which we just had April Fool's this past week. A company called GameStation out of the UK changed their terms of service on their website to say that by accepting this agreement, you have surrendered your immortal soul to the company, which may then resell it at their discretion, unless you select this box to opt out of giving away your mortal soul. And by the way, if you do so, you'll also get a $5 gift card. 88% of the people, 7,500 people that day, did not select to retain their immortal souls and get a $5 gift card. So it would seem that a very large percentage of people don't actually read those agreements. No, I get a big kick out of that as well.
I don't read them. I mean, there are a few places I read, right? Because I have to for legal reasons, right? There are a few services where I have to kind of read. When I do like my streaming service and all these kind of things, there are technical reasons and legal reasons I have to make sure I cross my T's and dot my I's. But for the most part, like the Facebook's agreements or the Twitter agreements, no one reads those damn things because they're pointless. Or when you go sign up for a free account on, I don't know, pick your free service that you use 3 times, to make a graphics or whatever. No one reads those things. And, but at the same time, what's the actual impact of not reading those things for the average person, right? It means actually kind of nothing, right?
Yeah. And that's part of the issue is that they can plan out and understand all of the corner cases and unusual situations and things that you're not even going to worry about because you don't expect them to happen. Like what happens if I get in a major accident and I'm, in a hospital for 3 months? What happens to my credit card at that point? Do I get a delay or, am I racking up late fees and having creditors call me while I'm sitting in a hospital bed? They have the time to think about all those corner situations when we don't. And, for the most part these days, here in the US, people are not using that for malicious purposes. But in the past, it has been. If you look back to the mining towns in the Midwest in the 1800s, people would sign an agreement and they'd get taken off to the Midwest somewhere. And, oh, well, you sign an agreement, you're getting paid, $150,000 a year to do, some basic mining. But oh, by the way, you've got to rent from us. And here's the cost for your house. It's $5,000 a month. And you want food? Oh, that's going to cost you $3,000 a month. And imagine if you would, Elon Musk saying, hey, let's all go to Mars. And you get there and you suddenly have to start paying for air. It's not like you're not going to pay for air. It's another way that unscrupulous people can take advantage of the slightest loophole to create duress and coercion. And that's another piece, another area where it is appropriate for government to step in is when duress or coercion is involved. As a libertarian, I'd like to see as many business relationships voluntary as possible. One of the things that comes up regularly is sex work. Absolutely think that should be something people should be able to choose to do so long as it's voluntary. But I have concerns about it. How do you know that it is really voluntarily and not coerced? How do you know that somebody didn't graduate from college, get their first job, they got a lease on an apartment and a new a car loan, and they're just getting started, and they walk into the office a week after they started work, and their boss says, by the way, I've got a new job responsibility for you, and unzips his fly. That's not okay. So I would say that that's an example of something that can't be regulated the same way people mow lawns, where, hey, anybody should be able to mow a lawn. It shouldn't be regulated at all by the government. But there needs to be something different about that sort of a change in responsibilities. Not the same as going from trimming the hedges to mowing the lawn. It's a different kind of change.
Well, because based upon history, if nothing else, right? We have to understand history, that a lot comes along with that line of work, and so we have to be very careful. There's a lot of dangers, right? That's a very dangerous line of work. And what do we do in other dangerous lines of work? We try to mitigate those dangers, and whether it's through laws or regulations, or whether it's through insurance, ways, right? Insurance. Some of the best things we've actually done has been through insurance, like the UL. The Underwriters Laboratory, where insurance made certifications processes. And so, maybe you can do something like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be a government solution, but there has to be an actual solution. Yep. And you're right, because at some point, coercion or duress becomes fraud, right? It's no longer an agreement. It's just fraud. It's, and fraud is a violation of a person. It's a violation of a person. It's a violation of their property. And so fraud is something that, is even amongst us libertarians, that fraud is something the government has I don't know if it's a duty, a responsibility to step into and deal with, because who else is going to do it?
Right? I mean, I've talked to people who think that everything should be able to be handled privately, maybe through private arbitration or what have you, but they're the ultimate arbiter. If there are two parties that, hey, someone says, hey, I'm calling shenanigans. This guy's doing the wrong thing. He's trying to pull a fast one. For example, if there wasn't regulations about that, hey, I just got diagnosed with cancer, and my landlord gave me 3 days notice to get out of my property. That's why there's usually 30 days notice required everywhere, because people need a little time. Landlord doesn't need any time to change the rent, but a person who's living in a property needs time to move and something appropriate based on the disparity of transaction costs. And that's another area that is significant, is if two parties have different costs to a transaction, it's an opportunity for one of them to behave badly. And that's another area.
That's actually the problem with a private moderation, private mediation services, right? Is because, at least with a government running, theoretically anyway, maybe not in practice, but theoretically, at least the government can balance the scales better, right, than a private service does. Because, ExxonMobil and me going into a mediation service, we have two vastly different, accesses to resources. Right. But, a judge, a government judge his paycheck comes from a third party. His paycheck's not coming from both of us, or in that particular case, Exxon's going to be able to pay a lot more money than I am, right? So I'm likely going to have to get screwed, right? That's just the way it's going to be.
And there's all kinds of tactics that are used in those situations. Like, if the costs are supposed to be split evenly, Exxon will run up the costs to make it prohibitive for you to pursue it. If the costs are not split evenly, they have other techniques to use additional resources to their advantage.
And so the point of a genuine third party, a completely disinterested third party that has literally no dog in the fight. They get paid by general taxes. And that's kind of the theory. Now, it doesn't work very well in practice, but it works better than the alternative, right? I suppose we're all, we settle it with guns at the OK Corral again. That's,
Yeah, that didn't last too long. It,
that's not a good way to settle. That's not a good way to settle disputes. Violence is not a good way to settle disputes. And so part of the reason we have, at least local governments, is so we don't have to do that. So we don't have to resort to violence to settle disputes.
And you talked earlier about local resources like fire departments and roads and things like that, and people being willing to pay for them. And they do add up. $20 here, $30 here on your local tax bill. It ends up becoming a lot of money. But yeah, that is one area that people talk about the common good, and that's one of the areas where we've gotten into some very dangerous waters here in California. In the preamble to our Constitution, it talks about promoting the general welfare. Well, that's been taken to mean whatever someone wants it to mean, to help whoever they want to help in the community. And that's a very different thing from, hey, we want to have some basic services that everyone's going to need in our township for the most part. Should people be able to opt out of them? It's hard to opt out of the fire department. They used to do that. You could have a fire department service and the next house could not have the service, and the one after that could. And guaranteed someone was going to be playing the game of the free rider situation, where they're just counting on the fact that their two neighbors have fire insurance, and so they don't have to have it because they're not worried about it. And then the fire department has a problem. If the house in the middle catches on fire, do they let it burn until it gets to the house that they're insuring, or do they start defending it? It's just easier to just do the whole thing. And for many of these things, the economy of scale, it makes sense. And people talk about, hey, property tax and what it covers when you buy property. If those property taxes were used for what they're supposed to be used for the basic services associated with the house, then things would work out. The problem is those funds get misappropriated. They get allocated or misused for other things. They get used for administrative costs, and that's where things go sideways.
If they stuck to, making sure the water was clean, the sewer was processed properly, the garbage was picked up, and the potholes got filled, I don't think people would be complaining as much. But the potholes don't get filled. The water is clean most of the time. The sewer works pretty good. But, the garbage service gets worse and worse every year. You pay more to get less. The bureaucracy gets bigger, but yet somehow nothing works. Everything works worse. And so it's, that's why we dislike the general public dislikes the taxes. It's not that they mind paying taxes. It's that they mind that they're not getting the results from their taxes that they want. They want their roads to be good. They want their schools to be good. They want their police and fire departments to do the jobs they want them to do, not the jobs they don't want them to do. Yeah. And we don't get it. And why we don't get it is a complicated question. That's a question for a different show, I suspect.
The system itself has become self-aware and is gaining momentum. And, it happens worse than anything in the school systems, because they think that they can put a ballot referendum on any ballot and people will pay more to take care of the kids. So they take a bucket of money that's allocated for schools and they use it for something that's peripherally related to schools or not really related to schools. And then they ask for more money for the stuff that was supposed to be used for. And, people have caught on to it. They're very jaded to it. They're tired of it. And, we need true advocates for us as taxpayers in those situations. One of the things I like to look at is, go ahead.
No, so how do we actually figure out a way to move forward through all this stuff?
Yeah, as a libertarian, I want to find private ways of solving these problems wherever possible. You mentioned one of them, insurance and private organizations to guarantee transactions are a great way to handle a large number of situations that are not life endangering when it comes to risk. If the risk of my cell phone not working properly, that's my risk. That's not a problem. When it comes to automotive insurance, it's a good idea that everyone has automotive insurance, because people are going to get into accidents. People are able to self-insure. I think the same thing should apply to other types of insurance as well. There should be options to self-insure for things like unemployment, for things like SDI and other types of programs. And let's separate out the part that is truly an insurance program to make sure that I am covered versus the social welfare portion, which preferably would be handled through private charity. And I'd like to see us get back to the days where people could make donations that would come out of their tax base and let charitable organizations compete for the opportunity to do good work. And whoever's the most effective at taking care of the homeless, at feeding those who are hungry, at helping those who are encountering domestic violence, that those organizations would be rewarded for their additional service rather than getting a blank check from the government and there's no accountability, there's no checks and balances in that situation, which is how this was originally supposed to work, is checks and balances, making sure that everybody's doing their job.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's lots of services that we don't immediately think of. Community services that the government funds that we don't actually think of. You talked about homeless services. That's one of those things that used to be funded completely by charity, and now we have the homeless industrial complex, right? We call it now the homeless industrial complex, where they're spending millions and millions of dollars to house fewer and fewer people. It's a very strange thing.
And government's even making it illegal for churches to allow homeless people to sleep in their churches. Or, down in Los Angeles, there was a situation where a guy out of his own pocket made these 20 tiny homes that homeless people could live in. And the city took them and destroyed them rather than allowing someone to solve that problem privately. It's absolutely ridiculous how private solutions are not being used to handle some of these important issues.
Well, and then we had these solutions. And so now, instead of having little tiny homes on the street, you've got tent cities on the street. And, and so they're still on the street. They're just, instead of little tiny homes. And in my neighborhood, they closed down some of the low-end motels were causing problems in the neighborhood, right? And so they closed the low-end motels. So, of course, where did these people go? To the street. They had nowhere else to go. These were the last places. Those were the last places for them to live other than the street. And so they had nowhere else to go. So then so now they're living on tent cities and in the street. They've taken over empty lots. And now now the city has to go in there and clean. That's an excuse to spend millions of dollars to clean it up. They have a solution for their problem they created. And it's, but what do we do about that, right? How do we gather these community resources? How do we get these community services out of the hands of these people who are so connected with the bureaucracy that essentially they can't survive without it? They don't know how to survive anymore without the bureaucracy. They can't survive without being connected to the government. Unlike the old days where they just did the work, nowadays they work, half their job is filing grant paperwork, right? How do we compete with that?
I think that it starts with you and me reaching out to somebody we know and talking to them about how the solution isn't having the government going in and shutting down that hotel that they don't like, but for us as individuals to find solutions to the underlying problems, that it's up to us and not government to do those things. And getting back to the principle of freedom and individual responsibility, and us as citizens cleaning up our own street. We're so used to the street sweeper coming by. It used to be people would go out on their stoop and they'd sweep their stoop and they'd sweep the front of their area. These days people couldn't imagine not having a street sweeper coming by once in a while to clean their street for them. We've become complacent and accustomed to having other people take care of the responsibilities of making sure our neighborhoods are the way we want them. And the truth is, freedom isn't free. We have to do the work to make sure that it is, and maintains the type of neighborhoods that we want for ourselves and our families.
Maybe that's the real moral hazard of a large government there, Kevin, is that we become complacent and lazy. You get used to having other people do something. Hey, we're not going to do anything about the homeless because the government's there to do it. We're not going to do anything about the trash on the streets because the government's there to do it. We're not going to do everything about the societal decay because the government's supposed to do it. And
then on top of that, and I'm already paying all this money for the government to do it, I'm going to be I'm going to get in a sniff about it. I'm just not going to do anything. I'm just going to let it sit there. And that's how people get. That's how people are in Russia. In Russia, you remember the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
Mm-hmm.
They had that the different lifeline. They had the 50-50, they had the phone a friend, and they had the ask the audience. And so people could ask the audience, and the audience would vote on what the correct answer was. And if it was one of the early questions, you could get a pretty reasonable guess of what it was. Later questions, they might not be quite as accurate, but you might have a percentage of people who knew what it was, and you could kind of figure out, okay, this one got a few more answers than the other ones. Well, in Russia, nobody used the ask the audience because the audience would lie, and they would intentionally pick the wrong answer because they were like, why should you get all this money when we don't have it? That was their attitude after 50 years of socialism, was that they were so insistent that that person shouldn't get the money that they didn't want to root for them. I don't know what they were in the audience for if that was the case. Why were they even there watching the show if they didn't want the person to win? But that's how it was there.
No, they liked attention and watching them fail at the end, I think is kind of what that's about.
I want a world where I'm looking forward to my neighbors succeeding. I want them to be successful, not in place of me, but because their success improves my success. And that's an idea that we've gotten away from. The idea that, hey, that multi-billionaire who's, by the way, giving $1 billion a year to help with all sorts of things. Yeah, that is not an enemy. That's someone who's creating tens of thousands of jobs for society, providing services that many, many people love. This is not someone to be to be criticized. This is someone to be emulated. And if you look at the history of charitable organizations, our library system, Carnegie Hall, and the tremendous donations to music that Carnegie made, what Bill Gates has done for a variety of social efforts, including eradication of disease and computers in schools. The people who make that kind of money, they give back. They give back to their communities. They do it privately in a way that's 100 times as effective as any government program ever could be.
Yeah. No, we end them on that. We're going to end on that agreement there, Kevin. I want to thank you for being here. And we'll get you back at some other point to have some other conversations. And for all you out there, if you want to come on and have a conversation, you can reach out to me at Counterpoint at libertariancounterpoint.com. And, is there any closing thought as I sit there and try and, wrap the show up with a closing thought? All I can think of is that, with freedom comes responsibilities, but that responsibility is bigger than, we might want to know. Right. So be thoughtful with it.
And I'd also like to get a shout out to the smoked salmon caucus of the Libertarian Party, as I'm about to enjoy some smoked salmon for lunch.
The smoked salmon. Oh, God, there's a smoked salmon caucus.
Yes.
There is really a smoked salmon. I don't want to get into caucus problems with the Libertarian problem. No. Me and caucuses. What was it? I posted something the other day. Cocks are fun. Cocks are fun to play with, but caucuses are a pain in my ass.
James, thank you for having me on the show today. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to the next time.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Everybody, we will see you later. Please remember to love everybody. Goodbye.